All right, let's talk about the Second Amendment. What exactly does it say? What does it mean for the individual? What does it mean for the government? Why is there so much confusion behind it? So what it exactly says is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the reason it's so confusing to some people is because it's made up of two parts, here and here. I'll definitely give you guys my take on it. To me, it's crystal clear. There's no confusion behind it. And hopefully after I break it down, you guys will see that it's really not confusing at all. Here's an article from alumni.berkeley.edu. It reads, "The Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms," says Jesse Chopper, a UC Berkeley law professor emeritus and the former Berkeley law dean. But really, that's the beginning point of the conversation, as is true with most of the Bill of Rights. The intent is not totally clear, and in fact, the language of the Second Amendment is particularly confusing. And they think it's confusing because of the first part that talks about a well-regulated militia. So another article I want to address is from Cornell Law School. And it says, "Some scholars point to the prefatory language, a well-regulated militia, to argue that the framers intended only to restrict Congress from legislating away a state's right to self-defense. Scholars have come to call this theory the collective rights theory. A collective rights theory of the Second Amendment asserts that citizens do not have the individual right to possess guns and that local, state, and federal legislative bodies therefore possess the authority to regulate firearms without implicating a constitutional right." So basically, the collective rights theory just means Congress can't implement regulations, but local and state authorities, they can do it without having to worry about violating any constitutional rights. And again, this theory is completely focused around the simple fact that in the Second Amendment, it says a well-regulated militia. Well, what's a militia? So there are 3 points to the definition of a militia. A military force that is raised from the civil population to supplement a regular army in an emergency. A military force that engages in rebel or terrorist activities in opposition to a regular army. All able-bodied civilians eligible by law for military service. When they hear the first part of the Second Amendment that says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, they think to themselves, well, wait a minute, doesn't that sound like a police force? Isn't that able-bodied men and women who are out there with guns protecting us? So basically, if you were to take modern-day language and instead of militia, you swapped it out with police force. So a well-regulated police force being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the police force to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And if that sounds kind of weird to you, you're not alone. It absolutely does not make any sense. So if we go back and talk about the militia for a second, we could recognize even from the definition that it's separate from the government. It's not a bunch of people collecting a paycheck from the government to be on standby. There's already a military reservist force that we have, and they are part of the military. They are part of the government. And if the government were to try to do some tyrannical stuff, they would probably try to use that military, not a militia. And that's not to say that the militia wouldn't help the military if it came down to it and we had to defend our own borders. Absolutely, I think the militia would help the military. So the main takeaway is simply that a militia is, again, separate from the government. It's not an entity of the government. It's not within the government. They're not being paid by the government. The government cannot take command of a militia. A militia is comprised of citizens who have nothing to do with the government. And another very important key element here is when we talk about the Founding Fathers, for the most part, they were pretty educated men. They had just got done fighting a war, and they knew what a army was, and they knew what a police force was. But yet they chose to use the words militia. And all of these talking points have been revolving around the word militia. But if we add the second part, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This expresses that the Founding Fathers knew that the people would make up the militia. which again is separate from the government. And something that always makes me laugh when I hear it is when folks try to say that the Second Amendment only applies to a well-regulated military, a well-regulated army, or a police force. Can someone tell me when exactly in history did we ever need to clarify that a military needed to have weapons? And then another point I kind of want to address is the fact that some people tried to say that the Second Amendment only applies to muskets. Well, if we don't apply that rationality to any of the other amendments, why would we apply it to the Second Amendment? And again, this is one of those talking points where you would basically be having to ignore what the entire Constitution stands for. The Constitution is actually mainly for the government. It's meant to tell the government what they can and can't do. And it reminds people that we have inalienable rights. And I think the most obvious counterpoint to the theory that it only applies to muskets is the intent of the Second Amendment is to fight off a tyrannical government. How would we be expected to fight a tyrannical government if the government has M4s, M16s, fully automatic grenade launchers, fully automatic 50 cal machine guns, and we roll in with muzzle loading muskets? That makes no sense. And so to very quickly recap what my, theory is, the first part of the amendment, a well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state, I think that was the Founding Fathers expressing the importance of a well-regulated militia. Without citizens coming together, training themselves, having proficient arms, weapons, guns, ammunition, this again is separate from being regulated by the government because again that would defeat the purpose of the entire Constitution basically. But again, the Founding Fathers were, in the first part, simply expressing the importance of a well-regulated militia. And the second part, it continues and says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Because again, they knew that a militia would be comprised of people, citizens, separate from the government. And this again would explain the reason behind there being two different words here, the militia in the first part and the people in the second part. And I think the last note that I'm going to leave this on is, if we listen to James Madison, the founder of this country and someone who signed the Constitution, someone had written him a letter asking if the Second Amendment allowed for cannons to be mounted on his ship to protect himself from invaders, from pirates. And James Madison wrote back and said yes. So when we look at what one of the founders says about the Second Amendment, how it applies to individuals, how it can be used to protect your property and your own life, it's not just about fighting a tyrannical government. It is about preserving your own freedom and ensuring that no one else can impede on your rights.